You just need to be a breathing dead person because, see, sacrifices lay down. Sacrifices are on an altar. And here's some things you need to know about sacrifices. A sacrifice doesn't exist for itself. A sacrifice gets no credit. No one at the end of a sacrifice in the ancient Israelite culture, there would never be like this great moment of sacrifice and then someone would say, oh, wow, that was a good lamb. No, the sacrifice doesn't ever get glory. The sacrifice doesn't get credit. The whole point of the sacrifice is for one person to give glory and credit to someone else. And so the sacrifice is given to that other someone. In this case, in sacrifices cases, it's given to God. So the sacrifice doesn't get glory. The sacrifice doesn't get credit. The sacrifice is at the whim of the person performing the sacrifice. And I just got to let you know, if my body is going to be a sacrifice, well, should I be surprised if sometimes I feel pain? Yeah, that's what sacrifices do. Should I be surprised if sometimes my body is uncomfortable? Yeah, because that's what sacrifices do. Should I be surprised that someone else gets more credit than I think I deserve? Yeah, I should not be surprised because that's what sacrifices do. Should I worry about honor or glory or anything else? No. Because a sacrifice always exists for someone else. So if Paul says offer your bodies as living sacrifices, what he means is you have to recognize that you don't belong to you. Your bod belongs to God. I just made that up. How about that? I said it differently in the first service, so I could say I made it up right now. Your bod belongs to God, okay? So offer yourself as a living sacrifice. That means, okay, I understand that I'm still breathing, but beyond that, beyond the fact that I'm still breathing, and by the way, God is the one who's holding my life up anyway. He's the one who's continuing my body's functioning. He's the one who's keeping the breath flowing in me. But beyond the fact that I'm breathing, everything else about my body is as if it were dead. I don't need pleasure. I don't need comfort. I don't need all this other stuff if it somehow interferes with what God wants to do. Because the sacrifice is at the whim of the one who does the sacrifice. Living sacrifice. Paul also says this fascinating line. He said, "This is your true and proper worship." The Greek word behind that is logical, literally logical. That's the Greek word. Spelled Logikal. Logical is the Greek word there. The problem is in Greek, logical doesn't mean what it means in English. In English, logical means the set of principles and arguments and steps that lead you to a conclusion. Okay? So for us, logical means it's rational. There's a set of steps that I can reproduce to get to the conclusion. For the Greek mentality, though, logical, the literal word meant something that is absolutely, completely, totally, and in all other ways true. Logical meant that thing that is confidently, always, authentically true. So see, we use the word logical for the process. The Greeks would use the word logical for the result, the end. Something is logical only if it is demonstrably, totally, completely authentic and true. So Paul uses that word right here for true and proper. We translate it true and proper because that's the best way we can try to come up with it. If we use the word logical, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to the way we think. But Paul's point is your real, authentic, true worship, and worship here for Paul, that word that he uses there, means ritual. A ritual of offering service to someone else in a religious context. Your real authentic religion, your real authentic ritual, your real authentic worship is what? Giving your bod to God. Giving God complete and total authority over your body. That's worship. So, to all of you who think that Sunday church attendance is worship, to all of you who think that singing songs is worship, to all of you who think that listening to Christian music is worship, to all of you who think that doing anything religious is worship, I need to apologize for miscommunicating to you. Because real worship is when you completely say, God, you own my body. Everything this lump of flesh does is for God. That's worship. Okay, so you can worship by singing. And you can worship by sitting and listening. And you can worship by leaving the doors of this place and being a person who walks out there completely different from the rest of the world. Because the rest of the world is doing one thing, but your body doesn't belong to you. Your body belongs to God. And people see that and they're like, why are you making the choices you're making? Why are you making the decisions you're making? You're like, well, listen, God owns my body. So I'm just doing the kinds of things that God would do if his brain were stuck in this skull. That's worship. So on Sunday mornings, we gather together and we're trying to create an environment where worship happens. But the environment is not the worship. The music is not the worship. The stuff, the assembling together, the rituals, that's not the worship. The worship is when God gets your body. We've only finished verse 1. The second verse, Paul says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Paul's first line there, don't conform, is our next principle. Don't conform to the pattern of this world. Listen, this world has a whole bunch of patterns, and you've been part of some of those patterns. I don't know exactly what kind of music you listen to, but if we all shared what our favorite bands were, we could divide ourselves in this room according to different patterns. And then once you get into those different groups, you would say that this person's musical pattern also somehow aligns with my taste in clothing, and it aligns with my taste in television shows. Somehow those things align. And so our culture develops many subcultures. I looked on Wikipedia, 79 subcultures are listed on Wikipedia. Not all of them have good articles, but that's okay. 79 are listed on Wikipedia as American subcultures, whatever they might be. And it's because we all have this kind of different idea, this sense that I need to be part of something, and we find a pattern that fits us, and we join it. And then once we join it, we realize that it's really not us joining them, it's them pushing on us and shaping us and forming us. And Paul says, don't be conformed to the pattern of this world. And so you might say, okay, so the world, Paul is talking about popular culture. I'm not part of popular culture. I'm part of goth culture. And so I'm wearing black eyeshadow and black lipsticks. And so that for me, I've never done that, but kind of creeped me out a little bit. But so anyway, you could say, I'm doing that. That's not part of the world. I'm separate from the world. I'm different. Well, maybe. Or maybe you could say, I'm Amish and I'm separate from the world. Or maybe you could say, there's a whole bunch of weirdos out there and I'm just in the middle. I'm just pop. I'm just, I listen to what's on the radio and I watch American Idol and I think it's all cool and I'm just middle of the road. I'm not part of any subculture. It doesn't matter which one of those groups. They're all conforming to the pattern of the world because you know what? Every single subculture and every culture asks 4 questions. And the pattern isn't what questions you ask. The pattern is how you answer those questions. And so being conformed to the pattern of the world means I'm answering these questions the same way the world answers these questions. The 4 questions go like this. Who am I? Who do I hang with? Who's my authority? And what's my responsibility? Who am I? Who do I hang with? Who's my authority? And what's my responsibility? Every subcultural group asks the same questions, and it's how they answer the questions that forms the pattern of the world. And Paul is ready to help us understand that there's a different way of answering the questions entirely. And so we read the next line. But be transformed by the renewing of your mind. There's the principle. Be transformed by renewing your mind. See, it's not about trying to get yourself out of the world. It's about trying to get the world out of you. Transformed by renewing your mind. Paul says there's something going on mentally. The way you answer these questions determines whether you're following the pattern of the world or the pattern of God. But if you're following the pattern of God, this is fascinating. Let's read the rest of this verse. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. Have you ever been in that place where you said, I just want to know God's will? You know, you're a guy and you're like, I want to know, what is God's will for the woman that I marry? Which woman does God want me to marry? You're a woman. Which guy should I spend time with? Because one of these guys is going to be willing to marry me and one of these guys isn't. And which is God's will? Which house should I buy? Which car should I buy? Which major should I take in college? And should I go on to graduate school? What's God's will? Which church does God want me to attend? And we've got all kinds of questions about these details of God's will for us. And you know what? How do you know God's will? Very simple. Let your mind be renewed. If my mind gets more in line with how God works and how God answers questions, His will is going to be obvious. Not only will it be obvious, it will be good and pleasing and perfect. I believe there's a place for you and us to reach where our mind is so renewed to the things of God that we look at the world around us and the things we want are God's will for us. I believe there's a place for us to get to where the thing I see as good, pleasing, and perfect is God's will. And God's will looks good and pleasing and perfect to me. And it's not about you working harder, trying harder, or hanging out with better people, although those things help. It's about renewing your mind. Because if my mind gets squared away, the will follows suit. I understand God's will. So I put it this way. This is the summary of this whole transformational shift. Because of God's mercy, I give Him my body and let Him renew my mind. Because of God's mercy, I give Him my body and let Him renew my mind. I thought about just ending the message here and letting you do the rest of the chapter at home or in your life group or something. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. What about those people who aren't part of a life group? And so I decided, well, I'll just do a second message right now. We'll just move right on. So actually, as I thought more about it, I realized, wait a minute, the rest of this chapter isn't a second concept at all. The rest of chapter 12 and 13 is actually exactly along the lines of verses 1 and 2 in this respect. What Paul does for the rest of 12 and 13 is he asks the exact same cultural questions and then answers them from God's perspective.